I'd like to tell you about some measurements that we took looking at the data shared by an iPhone and a Google Pixel phone with regard to privacy. Okay, so there's been a lot of work and a lot of interest in the privacy of mobile apps. So not the system itself, but the apps running on it. More recently, of course, there was a lot of interest in contact tracing apps around COVID and current interest is around things like COVID passports and so on. And in fact, the current work was motivated by earlier studies looking at the privacy of those kind of apps, and in fact finding that the privacy of the underlying system, what they were running, was maybe more of an issue around the privacy of the apps themselves. We'll talk some more about that. Other kind of motivations for people could be concerned about privacy in apps, of course, is the surveillance capitalism ecosystem that's funding a lot of these apps when they're free. And of course, things like malware, even if you do privacy settings, maybe the apps just steal information and what's going on there. And it's all over the news and have been a lot of attention, but there's been far less attention on the mobile operating system itself, so iOS or Android. And what data is that system itself sharing with Apple and Google? And even if we don't use any apps, even if we just use the phone as a handset just to make phone calls and texts and so on, don't use any services, don't run any apps, what data is the phone itself sharing? And we don't really have a clear understanding of that. And that's what we set out to do in this study, was to take some measurements and try and understand that a bit better. So why Apple and Google? They completely dominate the mobile handset space, right? Between Apple and Google, you've got everything. It depends on where you are, of course, the split. So in the Western world, it tends to be roughly 50-50, depending on how wealthy your country is. And then depending on where you are, it might be more Android. So in India, it's far more Android than iOS. But wherever you are, those two dominate everything. And privacy is also prominent in the marketing for both, and in different ways. Apple actively markets itself around privacy, increasingly so, whereas Google is primarily an advertising company, and there's widespread concerns, as the cartoon shows, around their interest in collecting your data and the fact that when things are free, then you know that you're the product rather than the app, and so on, all those kind of things. So you'd expect some coming in advance to it. Would expect maybe that Apple's more private than Google or something like that. But let's see how it really looks. And before proceeding, it's also worth being clear what we mean by privacy. Privacy is not a well-defined idea. It depends on context and it changes. But the focus here is on the metadata in particular. Because of Snowden and so on, metadata has come to the fore, and people will commonly understand that metadata itself can be quite sensitive. So the sorts of metadata we're interested in here is identifiers sent along with data allow messages sent from the same phone to be linked together, but also allow relinking. So for example, we might have an advertising identifier on our Google phone or our Apple phone that we can reset as a user. But if that's sent along with hardware identifiers that are never changeable, like the hardware serial number, then if we reset the ad identifier, you can always relink it because the hardware identifier stays the same. So if things like that are going on, we would like to know about it. The potential for that, of course, I'm not claiming linking is really happening, but the potential for it. App usage, what apps you're looking at, of course, are revealing, even if you don't know the details of what you're doing inside the app, the very fact that you're looking at them, what apps you're looking at and when, it can be revealing. An IP address can be revealing. Mobile apps, mobile phones, whenever they connect to backend servers, necessarily release the IP address. IP address is a rough indicator of location by GeoIP services. And so here's an example looking at Trinity College where I work, and through the IP address it exactly gets the location. Now, universities are known to be quite easy to geolocate, and the accuracy of geolocation varies, so it's a rough location, but it has impacts on privacy. For example, if we can track over time even rough location, then that can be a substantial step towards de-anonymization. And if you know where you live, you know where you work, you're well on your way to figuring out who owns a handset just through the IP address. Okay, so that's the context. That's the kind of threats we're worried about. Here's what we actually did. So we took two phones, an iPhone and a Pixel 2. A Pixel because it's a Google brand phone, so there's no worries about other operating systems or software running on it. Then we did a factory reset and then basically left the phones alone and watched what the traffic was sent, recorded it, and had a look at it. To record the traffic, we set up a Wi-Fi access point under our control, which was a laptop. The handset connects to the internet through that access point, and then on the laptop we carry out a man-in-the-middle attack on the traffic. Now, if we try and do that crudely, then the SSL checks on the handset detect the man-in-the-middle attack and reject it, just kill all the connections. So we have to take some extra steps on the handset. So on the iPhone, we have to jailbreak it to get elevated privileges, and then we have to patch system processes to bypass SSL checks, and we used Cydia Substrate to do that. And we used the checkra1n jailbreak, which is a quite recent jailbreak on the bootloader, only available in the last couple of years. And on the Pixel, we rooted it so that we could install a system cert. And once we've installed the system cert, then that turns out to be enough to bypass all the checks. So actually, the technology for bypassing checks was much simpler on the Android phone than on the iPhone. But on both, was straightforward enough, and the software for doing that's on the web. After the factory reset, you come to a set of screens asking you about settings. The experimental setup, which is given in more detail in the paper, is to mimic a privacy-conscious but busy user. So that means when you're asked to share settings, you're going to say no or opt out. But you're not going to go down into all the guts of the settings, low-level settings, and dig around in there to change other settings, right? So you're too busy to do that. Most people don't change those. But we're not going to use any apps or services. We're not going to log in. We're just going to use the handset as a phone. So keep it nice and simple. So it's a clean baseline that allows clear comparisons between the two handsets, and we expect that real data collection in actual use would be higher than this. So it's a minimal baseline just to see the lie of the land. And we can see immediately, this is the iPhone onboarding screens, that share with Apple for the iPhone analytics is much more prominent as a button than the don't share. There's not an opt-in here, they're both equal. An opt-in, opt-out choice here, but it's certainly more prominent. And it's similar in the Pixel phone, the same onboarding process. Here it's an opt-out, by default you opt-in, there you have to opt-out. But either way, definitely the setup on these phones is all set up to encourage you to share data. We set all of those to off, because we're a privacy-conscious user. And then we watched what happens. So just looking at the volume of data to start with, and we'll come back to the reasons for these differences shortly. So the left-hand plot is the amount of data, just the volume of data, the bytes sent from the iPhone and the Pixel phone during startup, so after this factory reset, and then when lying idle. Now, after the factory reset, there's a whole bunch of updates fetched from Android in particular, and so that's why there's a big steep rise at the start. And so it's a bit more interesting to look at the idle case, where you can see that there's a difference in slope between the two curves, and there's quite a big gap between the amount of data uploaded. This is data bytes uploaded only, so the data leaving the phone, between Apple and Google, and the difference is between 10 and 20 times more data leaves the Google phone than the Apple phone, which it seems like a lot, so we'll dig into that a bit more. And the other aspect of it is this data transmission is pretty much continuous. The phone is factory reset, just sitting there doing nothing. Both phones connect pretty much continuously. On average, every 4.5 minutes a connection is made, even when the phone is idle and doing nothing. And so the natural question is, what's being sent? So just as a gallop through what's being sent, here's some of the highlights, or lowlights, depending on your point of view. So both the iPhone and the Pixel phone make these kind of authentication connections. It's called Grand Slam on the iPhone, and it's called a check-in on the Pixel phone. And they're quite similar, surprisingly similar actually. Both send a clutch of long-lived hardware and SIM identifiers, ones that just basically can't be changed. So the IMEI, which is a serial number engraved on the SIM slot on your phone, is sent for both. The phone number is sent to both. The hardware serial number is sent to both. The SIM IMSI, which is the unique serial number of your SIM that identifies it on the cellular network, is sent on the Google phone. The phone number is sent on the Apple phone. And none of these are easy to change. All are quite easily to link back to an individual, for example, your phone number. If you have to show a photo ID to get a SIM, as you have to in many countries, then immediately that's linked to your real identity, and so on. There's no opt-out from this data collection. Remember, this was a minimal setup, simple setup, and we've talked to both Apple and Google. There is no opt-out from this data collection. Second thing to bring your attention to is that when you insert a SIM into the phone, then that interesting event is logged by both Apple and Google. So Apple send a connection to albert.apple.com with the phone number and device details, the serial number, handset serial number, and IMEI. So it's linking the SIM strongly to the phone. Google sends it to a upload dynamic config endpoint, where they also send the phone number and a bunch of other information, again linked strongly to the, so here's the mobile carrier information there, linked strongly to the hardware devices. Again, there's no opt-out from this data collection. So how about differences? So here's some differences between Apple and Google on these phones. So the Apple makes these connections, where periodic connections, when location is on, where it sends the Wi-Fi MAC address of a nearby device, in this case it's the access point, plus the GPS location. Now these are hex encoded, but when you decode them, it's the GPS location, and it's accurate. They locate back to the correct location. So Wi-Fi MAC addresses GPS tagged or sent from the iPhone address, and the only way to opt out of that is device-wide switching off of location. If the location is on the device, these are sent. And there's another type of connection which shares groups of nearby Wi-Fi addresses, not just a single Wi-Fi one, but it's of nearby devices. And that's quite worrisome because it potentially allows linking of the fact that devices were together in the same place. Now, there's no identifier. According to Apple, we haven't been able to verify it, but they say that in that connection, there's no identifier, no persistent identifier sent. There's a one single-use identifier used to prevent duplicates, but and so hopefully that's anonymous, but it's unexpected to see them sending that kind of information at all. With Google, the notable thing is this sheer volume of data, and that comes from telemetry that's sent to Google. Now, the content of that telemetry is binary encoded in protobufs. It's opaque, it's not publicly documented, and it's a massive job to reverse engineer and figure out what it is. So I don't know what it is, and no one outside of Google really knows what it is. They've promised to publicly document it, add new documentation, but that hasn't happened as yet. What I can do is, by looking at the contents of it, extract the log sources. Now, the Google Play Services acts as a central point for many log sources on inside the phone, and so this is the labels given from. You can see it's a long list, and I just don't know what they're doing. So there's no opt-out from this data collection. We've already opted out of analytics of users in diagnostics data sharing. We've already done that. This data collection happens despite that opt-out. There is no opt-out from this data collection that's happening that we don't know what it is. And so that's the source of the big difference between them. Both are sending, if we take the telemetry, Google telemetry out of the picture, both the iPhone and the Pixel are sending similar collections of identifiers that are strongly linked to the hardware, strongly linked to the SIM, that allow relinking of advertising identifiers and so on, because they're sent along with those identifiers, and that are hard to get away from. You know, if you change the SIM but keep it in your handset, then you can relink the handset to you because you've still got the hardware identifiers and so on. The telemetry that Google sent, don't know what it is. It includes, it's not just telemetry, it includes things like DevOps and A/B testing. So we're all acting as beta testers with no opt-out. Potentially, that's how it looks. So that seems like an unsatisfactory situation I would like to know more about. So just to wrap up, this table gives a kind of summary of the different identifiers that are shared by the Pixel and the iPhone. And you can see there's a lot in common. There's some differences. So the iPhone shares a local IP address, which is potentially revealing for lots of reasons. The Android one doesn't. The they share different MAC addresses. The Android phone, the Google phone shares the handsets MAC address, whereas the iPhone shares nearby MAC addresses. But otherwise, they have a lot in common. Location, of course, the iPhone shares location, even when you haven't given permission and there's no opt-out, whereas the Google have had a lot of attention for sharing location unexpectedly over the years, and so I seem to have responded to that. So surprisingly, telemetry aside, there doesn't seem like a huge difference between the privacy in this very basic test between the iPhone and the Pixel. It's important to bear in mind this is a baseline basic test, and it's already interesting that so much data is being shared that there's so little scope to opt out from it. But it's just a starting point. Thank you.